So the aim of this video is to give you some pointers on how to make that short 40-minute examination narrative highly effective and precise to its point. To make an effective narrative in such a short time constraint, it's really quite important to adhere to what Aristotle in his book Poetics named the three unities, to really be aware of as you're going through the unity of time, right? Make sure that your story is set in one day or short, sort of similar to 1 day of plot. Even a shorter time span is even better, but it's contained element of time, not an expansive sort of things that happen over a year or something. So try to keep it to 1 day if possible. In terms of unity of place, again, try to have it in one place. Don't let your characters run around to too many settings, because you're going to run out of time just in writing too many descriptions. You might have a couple of contrasting settings, but generally don't overdo the settings, right? And thirdly, the unity of action. Have one plot, right? Focus your story on one event throughout. Don't have too many side stories and side tracks. Thirdly, think about how to use the stimulus or the question that's given you. You don't want to be too literal, so that practice question we did this week with the 4 masks in different colors, you don't need your characters to be wearing 4 different masks or different colors, right? Think of them as the character, when he's in a certain setting, he puts on a certain type of personality. He changes with the mood or the setting he's in. So don't take it too literal. Secondly, make it obvious, right? It should be clear what element of what stimulus or what question you're referring to, if there is a selection of them. Even if there's not selection, you still need to make the question elements obvious in your story. And make it authentic. It shouldn't feel like, oh yeah, I've just written a story and in the last line I'm going to insert the stimulus, but rather have it feel authentically part of your story throughout. So make sure that's part of your planning. For an area of study essay, it is crucial that you link things back to the concept. So whether the concept is identity, whether it's the migrant experience, whether it's change, discovery, or belonging, you need to link your entire story to that concept. And the whole story should be aimed at elaborating on that particular issue in some way, right? So explore element of your concept, in our case, identity, in your story. In the practice stories, some of you struggle with the subject matter. I want to give you some very strict pointers. If we start over here with the no-nos, your story should not have violence, right? There shouldn't be any excessive murdering, any machine gun scenes, and that includes suicide, right? We don't want the characters, and I can see how this is an easy trap to fall into. You're dealing with identity, people have identity crises, and they want to off themselves. We don't want that in your story, okay? That's not what the markers want to read, and if you play that too far, then you're going to end up in counselor sessions, and you don't need that, right? So focus your story on things that are relevant. Stay away from violence. Secondly, we don't want sex, right? There has to be appropriate for a classroom context. If you're not happy for us to read your story to your parents, then don't write it. And there shouldn't be any drug romantic type things, or students fighting over who wants to get high and who doesn't, or all my friends were trying to make me drink alcohol but I didn't want to. Stay away from the drugs. It just reeks of adolescent immaturity, so just don't go there. And lastly, and this one is probably a bit trickier when you're dealing with identity, is try to avoid teenage angst, right? Because again, it's so easy to become cliche. People who don't fit in because everyone else is going to the party, people who are not wearing the same clothes as their friends, all those typical teenager issues that obviously you deal with every day, but that people don't really want to read about. So no teenage angst. Instead, try to play to your strengths, right? Look at what you actually know really well. So if you're into chess, you play chess every night and you go to chess club meetings and things, then make your characters maybe fit into that. Make the imagery about chess, make the characters people who go and watch it, or people who play it, or some sort of, essentially make the imagery and the characters really true to that particular area. You might be an expert mountain biker, you know lots of bikes, so you can use imagery that has to do with cycling, you can use characters that are typical cyclist type characters or cyclist followers, people who watch it, people who do newscasts on it, but you can use the right kind of imagery, you can use the right kind of cliche and jargon, and make it actually feel really authentic. So kind of play to your strengths when you come up with the subject matter for your story. You're not going to be writing about being a marine helicopter pilot from America, because you don't know anything about what that's actually like other than what you've seen in movies and fiction, and that's not true. So instead, think of something that you know well and try to work with that as your starting point. Next, I want to talk about the narrative arc, because it's something we've talked about a fair bit in class. Traditionally, you've been taught in middle school to set up your stories with an orientation, a complication, and a resolution. So in the classical, there's a little girl who's got a Red Riding Hood, and she's got a basket full of food, and she walks out in the forest, and she meets a wolf, and he says, "Hey, let's see you later." And then she continues on to grandma, and then there's a big conflict and confrontation at grandma's place, and then in comes the hunter, and we kind of resolve it all, the climax, and we kind of go down in intensity and tension, and there's kind of a coda or a moral on the end. That's kind of the traditional model that you've been taught. The problem for you in an examination essay of this type is you don't have the time necessarily to set all this up and make it work. Particularly the orientation part tends to almost get boring, right? And it's really hard to do that well in little time. So instead, what I've been trying to say is start and make your stories more in medias res. So essentially what in medias res means is we're starting in the middle of the action. So rather than starting back here with the orientation, you could, for instance, start here, right, with the encounter between the girl and the wolf in the forest, and we get emphasis on the big scary teeth and how you must make sure that you stick to the path and don't veer off it, but hurry up to your grandma. And then we go into the sort of the orientation bit where you talk about the little girl, how she's going to her grandma with the friend, the basket's getting heavy, etc., etc. And then we get the usual kind of climax here with the grandmother's house experience, following the same kind of resolution and moral and coda at the end. What that in medias res achieves is it does engage your reader from the start. It forces you to be engaged with the story, and there's no downtime. You use your 40 minutes to create a narrative that's riveting and captivating, and you're not going to be driven into expanding your timeline too far. You'll focus on doing a one in terms of time, unity of time. You're going to contain your time much better, hopefully. Some of you struggle a bit with tense in your stories, and verb tense particularly. And I think really what it comes down to is just concentrating while you're writing. Keep the focus on where is the setting. Is this set in the past, is it set in the present, or is it set in the future in terms of the characters' lives? Presumably most stories would be set in the past or the present. So you'd be using past tense or present tense throughout. But then really keep that in the forefront of your mind as you're writing, so you're not shifting. So if it's something that happened in the past, then keep thinking about that. Don't let your mind veer off into, and then I walk down the thing and whatever, but keep it all in the past tense all the way through, if that's where you're sticking. So really there's no key here other than just keeping yourself focused on who's telling the story and from what perspective. Are they looking backwards, or are they telling the story as it's happening? And I guess related to this issue is the idea of the narrative stance. Who is actually speaking? Who's telling the story? Is it a first-person story, someone telling about myself and I and what I was doing? Is it a third-person story, he, she, it? Or is it even a second-person story, which kind of reads more like a role play or an interactive novel? You do this, and then you do this, and you... which is probably more of a difficult stance to take. So once you've chosen what persona is telling the story, then think of are they omniscient? Do they know everything that's going on? Are they even omnipotent, so that they're actually changing the story as they go through? Or are they just purely observing and reflecting? And if that is the case, are they actually aware of what all the other characters are doing? Or do they just have their own perspective? So just keeping those things in mind. So this story is being told by one little girl walking down the forest road. Then she's not going to know what's happening in the other place. You're not going to know about the wolf going into grandma's house, etc. So you need to kind of keep those things in mind. So maybe if you need to swap between the two settings, then you either need two voices or you need an omniscient narrator who can tell the story from both sides. So I keep telling you to try to show more in your writing and to use showing rather than telling. And simply that's because if you do tell too much, it's jarring, it's annoying, it becomes descriptive, right? I went to the coffee shop, I ordered coffee, I drank it, it was tasty. I put my cup down, I picked it up again, I drank some more. If you're just going to describe what happens, it doesn't really add any depth, it doesn't really do anything, it's just describing a process, as opposed to showing us what's happening and thereby engaging the audience and engaging the character in telling the story. So for instance, the same kind of narrative, you might actually try to push your identity angle through that showing as well. So rather than saying I drank some of the coffee, you would say the rim of the coffee cup was hot against my lips, and the scent of the brew reminded me of our family gatherings at home at Grandma's place. There's an element of belonging and identity in that sort of image. So when you're writing to show, it's more about the secondary effect that the image has, or the act has on the character or on things around. So rather than he walked down the street, you might have the echo of footsteps between the houses or something to kind of show what's going on as opposed to tell. In terms of keeping that unity of time and action, you need to contain your story in terms of characters and try not to develop too many characters, but rather try to focus on one character that's fully developed. That might be your antagonist, it might be your protagonist, but give them depth in terms of interests, in terms of smells, in terms of likes and dislikes, in terms of what they do and how they behave, so that one character has a three-dimensional presence, and then the others might be there to supplement some of this behavior and this character. When it comes to bringing life to your writing, the most effective way to do that is through imagery. Right? So you want to try to have images, things that appeal to one of your five senses, so visual, tactile, olfactory, gustatory, or oral imagery throughout your stories. But you don't want to overuse it. It shouldn't be there all the time. It shouldn't be a struggle to kind of get through all the images to understand what's going on. But you want some authentic imagery in there to bring life to the story. And try really hard to create your own images. If you just use title cliches, if you talk about giving it 110% or meeting at the foot of the stairs or broke into 1,000 pieces, they're all kind of images that we've heard so many times that we don't even think of them as imagery. And really what a powerful image should make the reader picture this particular thing in their mind, right? If it actually makes me eventuate a smell and try to think what a smell is like, then that is a powerful image. If you think of a noise, and if your story is set in a school context and there's a noise in the middle of the night and you say it sounded like a gunshot, is again very cliche, right? If instead you can find an image that really suits that context, say the noise in the night sounded a lot like when I threw my maths book on my desk in period 3. If that's kind of the same kind of noise and you're also dealing with a school setting, then that's more of a context type appropriate image, something that's familiar to this kind of story. Again, and if you can make the imagery a bit unusual and thereby again engage the reader, that might be even more effective. So rather than using a titled, if you use a story set in a zoo, instead of talking about he was angry like a hungry lion, if you actually say something like, people might not realize this, but the most angry animal in the zoo is the aggravated chimpanzee, which does whatever it does at night to show its anger, then that's more of an unusual image that's going to make the reader a bit more interested in what you're writing. So, where to from here? What can you prepare? What can you do for Monday's practice lesson and obviously for next term's examination? Well, there's a few things. First of all, think of some potential scenarios. So think of some potential settings where your story might take place. And once you've got those settings kind of cleared out for you, then who might the character or a couple of characters be in those kind of settings, right? And try to give those characters some depth in terms of how they speak, what they wear, kind of give them some sort of characteristics. And then you look at all three of these and how together they will work towards exploring that concept of identity. What are you trying to say about identity in the confines of your story? So that you're keeping it tight, you keep it focused, and then you've got, I think there are enough aspects to memorize, and yet you've got room there to modify that to work with the particular question given on the day.